Hello, welcome back to Storytime. So as you can see, I have some new art up right here. This fancy stuff. I finished this, I started out with this in a line drawing I did by hand. I inked in all of the outlines and then I colored it in on two of my art streams, my first ever art stream, using GIMP, which is a free image creator or adjuster or something like that, and you can find it online. It takes a little while to get used to, but I've been getting the hang of it. This illustration is from the book that I'm going to be starting today, Heidi, which is one of my favorite children's, which is one of my favorite children's books, and this is my favorite scene from it, and we'll probably get to that scene today. You'll recognize it when we get to the scene. And I have to admit, I was a little apprehensive about coloring it in because this is a very dear memory from, my childhood reading and growing up and stuff like that. For a kind of a noob using GIMP, I have to say it's not bad. I'm especially pleased with how the fire came out. Anyways, Snockings is here. She's my cat. And so I guess we're ready to go ahead and get started. So, if I stumble over the words, just heads up. I am reading from a very old copy of the book. It's about 80 years old, thereabouts. And some of the ink might have rubbed off. But this is the book, the exact edition that I grew up reading, so I wanted to read that one when I read to you. So let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 1. Heidi's First Mountain Climb. On a bright June morning, two figures, one a tall girl and the other a child, could be seen climbing a narrow mountain path that winds up from the pretty village of Mayenfeld to the lofty heights of the Alm Mountain. In spite of the hot June sun, the child was clothed as if to keep off the bitterest frost. She did not look more than 5 years old, but what her natural figure was like would be hard to say, for she had on apparently two dresses, one above the other, and over these a thick red woolen shawl. Her small feet were shod in thick, nailed mountain shoes. When the wayfarers came to the hamlet known as Dorfli, which is situated halfway up the mountain, they met with greetings from all sides, for the elder girl was now in her old home. As they were leaving the village, a voice called out, "Wait a moment, Deet. If you are going up on the mountain, I will come along with you." The girl thus addressed stood still, and the child immediately let go of her hand and seated herself on the ground. "Are you tired, Heidi?" asked her companion. "No, I'm hot," answered the child. "We shall soon get to the top now. You must walk bravely on a little longer and take good long steps, and in another hour we shall be there," said Deet. They were now joined by a stout, good-natured-looking woman, who walked on ahead with her old acquaintance. "And where are you going with the child?" asked the one who had just joined the party. "I suppose it is the child your sister left?" "Yes," answered Deet. "I'm taking her up to Uncle, where she must stay." This child stay up there with Alm Uncle? You must be out of your senses, Deet. How can you think of such a thing? The old man, however, will soon send you both packing off home again." "He cannot very well do that, seeing that he is her grandfather. He must do something for her. I've had the charge of the child till now, and I tell you, Barbel, I am not going to give up the chance which has just fallen to me of getting a good place for her sake." "That would be very well if he were like other people," said Barbel, "but you know what he is. And what can he do with a child, especially with one so young? The child cannot possibly live with him. And where are you thinking of going yourself?" "To Frankfurt, where an extra good place awaits me," answered Deet. "I'm glad I'm not the child," exclaimed Barbel. "Not a creature knows anything about the old man up there. He will have nothing to do with anybody, and never sets his foot inside a church from one year's end to another. When he does come down once in a while, everybody clears out of his way. The mere sight of him, with his bushy gray eyebrows and immense beard, is alarming enough. All kinds of things are said about him. You, Deet, however, must certainly have learnt a good deal concerning him from your sister. Yes, but I'm not going to repeat what I heard. Suppose it should come to his ears. I should get into no end of trouble about it. Barbel put her arm around through Deet's in a confidential sort of way and said, Now do just tell me what is wrong with the old man. Was he always shunned as he is now? And was he always so cross? I assure you I will hold my tongue if you will tell me. Very well, then, I will tell you. But just wait a moment, said Deet, looking around for Heidi, who had slipped away unnoticed. I see where she is, exclaimed Barbel. Look over there, and she pointed to a spot far away from the footpath. She's climbing up the slope yonder with Peter and his goats. But tell me about the old man. Did he ever have anything more than his 2 goats and his hut? I should think so, indeed, replied Deet with animation. He was at one time the owner of one of the largest farms in Domlsk, where my mother used to live. But he drank and gambled away the whole of his property, and when this became known to his mother and father, they died of sorrow, one shortly after the other. Uncle, having nothing left to him but his bad name, disappeared. Oh, stop it! Sorry, my cat is drinking my water. Let's backtrack a little. He drank and gambled away the whole of his property, and when this became known to his mother and father, they died of sorrow, one shortly after the other. Uncle, having nothing left to him but his bad name, disappeared, and it was heard that he had gone to Naples as a soldier. After 12 or 15 years, he reappeared in Domlsk, bringing with him a young son whom he tried to place with some of his kinfolk. Every door, however, was shut in his face, for no one wished to have any more to do with him. Embittered by his treatment, he vowed never to set foot in Domlsk again, and he then came to Dorfli, where he lived with his little boy. His wife, it seemed, had died shortly after the child's birth. He must have accumulated some money during his absence, for he apprenticed his son Tobias to a carpenter. He was a steady lad, and kindly received by everyone in Dorfli. His father, however, was still looked upon with suspicion, and it was even rumored that he had killed a man in some brawl in Naples. But why does everybody call him Uncle? Surely he can't be uncle to everyone living in Dorfli, asked Barbel. Our grandmothers were related, so we used to call him Uncle, and as his father had family connections with so many people in Dorfli, soon everyone fell into the habit of calling him Uncle, exclaimed Deet. What happened to Tobias? Further questioned Barbel, who was listening with deep interest. Tobias was taught his trade in Mel's, and when he had served his apprenticeship, he came back to Dorfli and married my sister Adelaide. But their happiness did not last long. 2 years after their marriage, Tobias was killed in an accident. His wife was so overcome with grief that she fell into a fever from which she never recovered. She had always been rather delicate and subject to curious attacks, during which no one knew whether she was awake or asleep. And so 2 months after Tobias had been carried to the grave, his wife followed him. Their sad fate was the talk of everybody far and near, and the general opinion was expressed that it was a punishment which Uncle deserved for the godless life he had left. Our minister endeavored to awaken his conscience, but the old man grew only more wrathful and stubborn, and would not speak to a soul. All at once we heard that he had gone to live up on the Alm mountain, and that he did not intend to come down again. Since then he has led his solitary life up there, and everyone knows him now by the name of Alm Uncle. Mother and I took Adelaide's little one, then only a year old, into our care. When Mother died last year, and I went down to the baths to earn some money, I paid old Ursel to take care of her. So you see I've done my duty. Now it's Uncle's turn. But where are you going to yourself, Barbel? We are now halfway up the Alm. We've just reached the place I wanted, answered Barbel. I must see Peter's mother, who is doing some spinning for me. So goodbye, Deet, and good luck to you. She went towards a small, dark brown hut, which stood a few steps away from the path in a hollow that afforded it some protection from the mountain wind. Here lived Peter, the 11-year-old boy, with his mother Brigitte, and his blind grandmother, who was known to all the old and young in the neighborhood as just grandmother. Every morning Peter went down to Dorfli to bring up a flock of goats to browse on the mountain. At sundown he went skipping down the mountain again with his light-footed animals. When he reached Dorfli, he would give a shrill whistle, whereupon all the owners of the goats would come out to take home the animals that belonged to them. Deet had been standing for a good 10 minutes looking about her in every direction for some sign of the children and the goats. Meanwhile, Heidi and the goatherd were climbing up by a far and roundabout way, for Peter knew many spots where all kinds of good food, in the shape of shrubs and plants, grew for his goats. The child, exhausted with the heat and weight of her thick clothes, panted and struggled after him, at first with some difficulty. She said nothing, but her little eyes kept watching first Peter, as he sprang nimbly hither and thither in his bare feet, clad only in his short, light breeches, and then the slim-legged goats that went leaping over rocks and shrubs. All at once she went down on the ground and began pulling off her clothes and stockings. Then she unwound the hot red shawl and took off her frock. But there was still another to unfasten, for Deet had put the Sunday dress on over the everyday one to save the trouble of carrying it. Quick as lightning, the everyday frock followed the other, and now the child stood up, clad only in her light, short-sleeved undergarment. She stretched out her little bare arms with glee, leaving all her clothes together in a tidy little heap. She went jumping and climbing up after Peter and the goats, as nimbly as any of the party. Now that Heidi was able to move at her ease, she began to enter into conversations with Peter. She asked him how many goats he had, where he was going to go with them, and what he had to do when he arrived there. At last, after some time, they came within view of Deet. Hardly had the latter caught sight of the little company climbing up towards her when she shrieked out, "Heidi, what have you been doing? What a sight you have made of yourself, and where are your 2 frocks and the red wrapper? And the new shoes I bought, and the new stockings I knitted for you? Everything gone, not a thing left. What can you have been thinking of, Heidi? Where are all your clothes?" The child quietly pointed to a spot below on the mountainside and answered, "Down there." "You good-for-nothing little thing!" exclaimed Deet angrily. "What could have put into your head to do that? What made you undress yourself? What do you mean by it?" "I don't want any clothes," said Heidi. "You wretched, thoughtless child, have you no sense in you at all?" continued Deet, scolding and lamenting. "Peter, you go down and fetch them for me as quickly as you can, and you shall have something nice." And she held out a bright new piece of money to him that sparkled in the sun. Peter was immediately off down a steep mountainside, taking the shortest cut, and was back again so quickly with the clothes that even Deet was obliged to give him a word of praise as she handed him the promised money. Peter promptly thrust it into his pocket, and his face beamed with delight, for it was not often that he was the happy possessor of such riches. "You can carry the things up for me as far as Uncle's, as you are going the same way," went on Deet, who was preparing to continue her climb up the mountainside, which rose in a steep ascent immediately behind the goatherd's hut. Peter willingly undertook to do this, and followed after her. After a climb of more than 3/4 of an hour, they reached the top of the mountain. Uncle's hut stood on a projection of the rock, exposed indeed to the winds, but where every ray of sun could rest upon it, and a full view could be had of the valley beneath. Behind the hut stood 3 old fir trees with long, thick, unlopped branches. Beyond these rose a further wall of mountain, the lower heights still overgrown with beautiful grass and plants. Against the hut, on the side looking towards the valley, Uncle had put up a seat. Here he was sitting, his pipe in his mouth and his hands on his knees, quietly looking out, when the children, the goats, and Deet suddenly clambered into view. Heidi was at the top first. She went straight up to the old man, put out her hand, and said, "Good evening, grandfather." So, what is the meaning of this?" he asked gruffly, as he gave the child an abrupt shake of the hand and gazed at her from under his bushy eyebrows. Heidi stared steadily back at him in return with unflinching gaze. Meanwhile, Deet had come up, with Peter after her. "I wish you good day, Uncle," said Deet as she walked towards him, "and I have brought you Tobias and Adelaide's child. You will hardly recognize her, as you have never seen her since she was a year old." "What has the child to do with me up here?" asked the old man curtly. "You there! He then called out to Peter, "Be off with your goats. You are none too early as it is, and take mine with you." Peter obeyed on the instant and quickly disappeared. "The child is here to remain with you," Deet made answer. "I have done my duty for her for these 4 years, and now it is time for you to do yours." "That's it, is it?" said the old man as he looked at her with a flash in his eye. "And when the child begins to fret and whine after you, what am I to do with her after then?" "That's your affair," retorted Deet. "If you cannot arrange to keep her, do with her as you like. You will be answerable for the result if harm happens to her, though you have hardly need to add to the burden already on your conscience." Now Deet was not quite easy in her own conscience about what she was doing, and consequently was feeling hot and irritable, and said more than she had intended. As she uttered her last words, Uncle rose from his seat. He looked at her in a way that made her draw back a step or two. Then, flinging out his arm, he said to her in a commanding voice, "Be off with you this instant, and get back as quickly as you can to the place whence you came, and do not let me see your face again in a hurry." Deet did not wait to be told twice. "Goodbye to you then, and to you too, Heidi," she called as she turned quickly away, and started to descend the mountain at a running pace, which she did not slacken till she found herself safely again at Dorfley. Chapter 2. A New Home with Grandfather. As soon as Deet had disappeared, the old man went back to his bench, and there he remained seated, staring at the ground without uttering a sound, while thick curls of smoke floated upwards from his pipe. Heidi, meanwhile, was enjoying herself in her new surroundings. She looked about till she found a shed, built against the hut, where the goats were kept. She peeped in, and saw it was empty. She continued her search, but presently came back to where her grandfather was sitting. Seeing that he was in exactly the same position as when she left him, she went and placed herself in front of the old man and said, "I want to see what you have inside the house." "Come then," said the grandfather, and he went before her towards the hut. "Bring your bundle of clothes in with you," he bid her as she was following. "I shan't want them any more," was her prompt answer. The old man turned and looked searchingly at the child, whose dark eyes were sparkling in delighted anticipation of what she was going to see inside. "She's certainly not wanting in intelligence," he murmured to himself. "And why shall you not want them any more?" he asked aloud. "Because I want to go about like the goats with their thin, light legs." "Well, you can do so if you like," said her grandfather. "But bring the things in, we must put them in the cupboard." Heidi did as she was told. The old man now opened the door, and Heidi stepped inside after him. She found herself in a good-sized room which covered the whole ground floor of the hut. A table and a chair were the only furniture. In one corner stood the grandfather's bed. In another was the hearth with a large kettle hanging above it, and on the further side was a large door in the wall. This was the cupboard. The grandfather opened it. Inside were his clothes. On a second shelf were some plates and cups and glasses, and on a higher one stood a round loaf, smoked meat, and cheese, for everything that Uncle needed for his food and clothing was kept in this cupboard. Heidi thrust in her bundle of clothes as far back behind her grandfather's things as possible, so that they might not easily be found again. She then looked carefully round the room and asked, "Where am I to sleep, grandfather?" "Wherever you like," he answered. Heidi was delighted, and began at once to examine all the nooks and corners to find out where it would be pleasantest to sleep. In the corner near her grandfather's bed she saw a short ladder against the wall. Up she climbed and found herself in the hayloft. There lay a large heap of fresh, sweet-smelling hay, while through a round window in the wall she could see right down the valley. "I shall sleep down here, grandfather," she called down to him. "It's lovely up here. Come and see how lovely it is." "Oh, I know all about it," he called up in answer. "I'm getting the bed ready now," she called down again as she went busily to and fro at her work. "But I shall want you to bring me up a sheet. You can't have a bed without a sheet. You want it to lie upon." "All right," said the grandfather, and presently he went to the cupboard, and after rummaging about inside for a few minutes, he drew out a long, coarse piece of stuff, which was all he had to do duty for a sheet. He carried it up to the loft, where he found Heidi had already made quite a nice bed. She had put an extra heap of hay at one end for a pillow, and had so arranged it that, when in bed, she would be able to see comfortably out through the round window. "That is capital," said her grandfather. "Now we must put on the sheet." They spread it out over the bed, and where it was too long or too broad, Heidi quickly tucked it in under the hay. It looked as tidy and comfortable a bed as you could have wished for, and Heidi stood gazing thoughtfully at her handiwork. "We've forgotten something now, Grandfather," she said after a short while. "What's that?" he asked. "A coverlid. When you get into bed, you have to creep in between the sheet and the coverlid." "Oh, that's the way, is it? But suppose I have not got a coverlid," said the old man. "Well, never mind, Grandfather," said Heidi in a consoling tone of voice. "I can take some more hay to put over me." And she was turning quickly to fetch another armful from the heap when her grandfather stopped her. "Wait a minute," he said, and he climbed down the ladder again and went towards his bed. He returned to the loft with a large, thick sack made of flax, which he laid tidily over the bed. "That is a splendid coverlid," said Heidi, "and the bed looks lovely altogether. I wish it was night so that I might get inside it at once." "I think we'd better go down and have something to eat first," said the grandfather. While the kettle was boiling, the old man held a large piece of cheese on a long iron fork over the fire, turning it round and round till it was toasted a nice golden yellow color on each side. Heidi watched all that was going on with eager curiosity. Suddenly some new idea seemed to come into her head, for she turned and ran for the cupboard, and then began going busily backwards and forwards. Presently Grandfather got up and came to the table with a jug and the cheese, and there he saw it already tidily laid with a round loaf and 2 plates and 2 knives, each in its right place. "Ah, that's right," said the grandfather. "I'm glad to see that you have some ideas of your own." And as he spoke he laid the toasted cheese on a layer of bread. "But there's still something missing." Heidi looked at the jug that was steaming away invitingly and ran quickly back to the cupboard. At first she could only see a small bowl left on the shelf, but she was not long in perplexity, for a moment later she caught sight of 2 glasses further back, and without an instant's loss of time she returned with these and the bowl and put them down on the table. "Good, I see you know how to set about things. What will you do for a seat?" The grandfather himself was sitting on the only chair in the room. Heidi flew to the hearth and dragged the 3-legged stool up to the table, sat herself down upon it. The grandfather filled the bowl with milk and pushed it in front of Heidi. Then he brought her a large slice of bread and a piece of the golden cheese and told her to eat. Heidi lifted the bowl with both hands and drank without pause till it was empty, for the thirst of all her long, hot journey had returned upon her. Then she drew a deep breath. In the eagerness of her thirst she had not stopped to breathe, and put down the bowl. "Was the milk nice?" he asked. "I never drank any so good before," answered Heidi. "Then you must have some more." And the old man filled her bowl again to the brim and set it before the child, who was now hungrily beginning her bread, having first spread it with the cheese, which, after being toasted, was soft as butter. The meal being over, the grandfather went outside to put the goat shed in order, and Heidi watched with interest while he first swept it out, and then put fresh straw for the goats to sleep upon. Then he went out to the little well shed, and there he cut some long round sticks in a small round board. In this he bored some holes and stuck the sticks into them, and there, as if made by magic, was a 3-legged stool just like her grandfather's, only higher. Heidi stood and looked at it, speechless with astonishment. "What do you think this is?" asked her grandfather. "It's my stool, I know, because it is such a high one, and it was made all of a minute," said the child, still lost in wonder and admiration. "She understands what she sees. Her eyes are in the right place," remarked the grandfather to himself. And so the time passed happily on till evening. Then the wind began to roar louder than ever through the old fir trees. Heidi listened with delight to the sound, and it filled her heart so full of gladness that she skipped and danced round the old trees as if some unheard-of joy had come to her. The grandfather stood and watched her from the shed. Suddenly a shrill whistle was heard. Down from the heights above, the goats came springing one after another, with Peter in their midst. Heidi sprang forward with a cry of joy and rushed among the flock, greeting first one and then another of her old friends of the morning. As they neared the hut, the goats stood still, and then two of their number, two beautiful, slender animals, one white and one brown, ran forward to where the grandfather was standing and began licking his hands, for he was holding a little salt which he always had ready for his goats on their return home. Peter went on down the mountain with the remainder of his flock. Heidi tenderly stroked the two goats in turn, jumping down in her glee at the pretty little animals. "Are they ours, grandfather? Are they both ours? Are you going to put them in the shed? Will they always stay with us?" Heidi's questions came tumbling out one after the other, so that her grandfather had only time to answer each of them with yes, yes. When the goats had finished licking up the salt, her grandfather told her to go and fetch her bowl and the bread. Heidi obeyed and was soon back again. The grandfather milked the white goat and filled her basin, and then breaking off a piece of bread, "Now eat your supper," he said, "and then go up to bed. Deet left another little bundle for you, with a nightgown and some other small things in it, which you will find at the bottom of the coverlet if you want them. I must go and shut up the goats, so be off and sleep well. Good night, grandfather. Good night. What are their names, grandfather? What are their names?" she called out as she ran after his retreating figure and the goats. "The white one is called Little Swan, and the brown one Little Bear," he answered. "Good night, Little Swan. Good night, Little Bear," she called again at the top of her voice. Then she ate her supper and went indoors and climbed up to her bed, where she was soon lying as sweetly and soundly asleep as any young princess on her couch of silk. As you can tell, I took a few liberties with my picture. I decided that I liked the scene of them just sitting side by side, and I forgot that her stool was tall. Let's be honest, I just forgot. But yes, that's her stool. Chapter 3. Little Bear and Little Swan. Heidi felt very happy next morning as she woke up in her new home and remembered all the many things that she had seen the day before, and which she would see again that day, and above all, she thought with delight of the dear goats. She jumped quickly out of bed, and a very few minutes sufficed her to put on the clothes which she had taken off the night before, for there were not many of them. Then she climbed down the ladder and ran outside the hut. There stood Peter, all ready with his flock of goats, and the grandfather was just bringing his two out of the shed to join the others. Heidi ran forward to wish good morning to him and the goats. "Do you want to go with them on to the mountain?" asked her grandfather. Nothing could have pleased Heidi better, and she jumped for joy in answer. The grandfather went inside the hut, calling to Peter to follow him and bring in his wallet. Peter obeyed with astonishment and laid down the little bag which held his meager dinner. "Open it," said the old man, and he put in a large piece of bread and an equally large piece of cheese, which made Peter open his eyes, for each was twice the size of the two portions which he had for his own dinner. "There now. Now there is only the little bowl to add," continued the grandfather, "for the child cannot drink her milk as you do from the goat. She is not accustomed to that. You must milk 2 bowlfuls for her when she has her dinner, for she is going with you and will remain with you till you return this evening. But take care she does not fall over any of the rocks. Do you hear?" They started joyfully for the mountain. Heidi went running hither and thither and shouting with delight, for here were whole patches of delicate red primroses, and there the blue gleam of the lovely gentian, while above them all laughed and nodded the tender-leaved golden citrus. Enchanted with all this waving field of brightly colored flowers, Heidi forgot even Peter and the goats. She ran on in front and then off to the side, tempting first one way and then the other, as she caught sight of some bright spot of glowing red or yellow. And all the while she was plucking whole handfuls of the flowers which she put into her little apron, for she wanted to take them all home and stick them in the hay, so that she might make her bedroom look just like the meadows outside. Peter had therefore to be on the alert, and his round eyes, which did not move very quickly, had more work than they could well manage, for the goats were as lively as Heidi. They ran in all directions, and Peter had to follow, whistling and calling and swinging his stick to get all the runaways together again. "Oh, thank you very much, John. I'm glad you could join me." Finally, they arrived at the spot where Peter generally halted for his goats to pasture, and where he took up his quarters for the day. It lay at the foot of the high rocks, which were covered for some distance up by bushes and fir trees, beyond which rose their bare and rugged summits. On one side of the mountain, the rock was split into deep clefts, and the grandfather had reason to warn Peter of danger. Having climbed as far as the halting place, Peter unslung his wallet and put it carefully in a little hollow of the ground, for he knew what the wind was like up there, and did not want to see his precious belongings sent rolling down the mountain by a sudden gust. Then he threw himself at full length on the warm ground and soon fell asleep. Heidi, meanwhile, had unfastened her apron and rolled it carefully round the flowers, laid it beside Peter's wallet inside the hollow. Then she sat down beside his outstretched figures and looked about her. The goats were climbing about among the bushes overhead. She had never felt so happy in her life before. She drank in the golden sunlight, the fresh air, the sweet smell of the flowers, and wished for nothing better than to remain there forever. Suddenly she heard a loud, harsh cry overhead, and lifted her eyes to see a bird, larger than any she had ever seen before, with great spreading wings, wheeling round in wide circles, and uttering a piercing, croaking kind of sound above her. "Peter! Peter, wake up!" called out Heidi. "See, the great bird is there! Look! Look!" Peter got up on hearing her call, and together they sat and watched the bird, which rose higher and higher in the blue air till it disappeared behind the gray mountain tops. "Where has it gone to?" asked Heidi, who had followed the bird's movement with intense interest. "Home to its nest," said Peter. "Is his home right up there? Oh, how nice to be up so high! Why does he make that noise?" "Because he can't help it," explained Peter. "Let's climb up there and see where his nest is," proposed Heidi. "Oh! Oh!" exclaimed Peter, his disapproval of Heidi's suggestion becoming more marked with each ejaculation. "Why, even the goats cannot climb up as high as that. Besides, didn't Uncle say that you were not to fall over the rocks?" Peter now began suddenly whistling and calling in such a loud manner that Heidi could not think what was happening, but the goats evidently understood his voice, for one after the other they came springing down the rocks until they were all assembled on the green plateau. Heidi jumped up and ran in and out among them, for it was new to her to see the goats playing together like this. Meanwhile, Peter had taken the wallet out of the hollow and placed the pieces of bread and cheese on the ground in the shape of a square, the larger two on Heidi's side and the smaller on his own, for he knew exactly which were hers and which his. Then he took the little bowl and milked some delicious fresh milk into it from the white goat, and afterwards set the bowl in the middle of the square. "Leave off jumping about, it is time for dinner," said Peter. "Sit down now and begin." Heidi sat down. "Is the milk for me?" she asked. "Yes," said Peter, "and the 2 large pieces of bread and cheese are yours also, and then when you have drunk up that milk, you are to have another bowlful from the white goat, and then it will be my turn." "And which do you get your milk from?" inquired Heidi. "From my own goat, the piebald one." Go on now with your dinner," said Peter, again reminding her it was time to eat. Heidi took up the bowl and drank her milk, and as soon as she had put it down empty, Peter rose and filled it again for her. Then she broke off a piece of her bread and held out the remainder, which was still larger than Peter's own piece, together with a whole big slice of cheese to her companion, saying, "You can have that, I have plenty." Peter looked at Heidi, unable to speak for astonishment. He hesitated a moment, for he could not believe that Heidi was in earnest, but the latter kept on holding out the bread and cheese, and as Peter still did not take it, she laid it down on his knees. He saw then that she really meant it. He seized the food, nodding his thanks and acceptance of her present, and then made a more splendid meal than he had known ever since he was a goatherd. Heidi, the while, still continued to watch the goats. "Tell me all their names," she said. Peter knew these by heart, so he began telling Heidi the name of each goat in turn as he pointed it out to her. She listened with great attention. It was not long before she could herself distinguish the goats from one another, and could call each by name, for each goat had its own peculiarities, which could not easily be mistaken. There was the great Turk with his big horns, who was always wanting to butt the others, so that the most of them ran away when they saw him coming, and would have nothing to do with their rough companion. Only Greenfinch, the slender and nimble little goat, was brave enough to face him, and would make a rush at him 3 or 4 times in succession. Then there was a little white snowflake, who bleated in such a plaintive and beseeching manner that Heidi already had several times run to it and taken its head in her hands to comfort it. Just at this moment the pleading young cry was heard again, and Heidi jumped up running, and, putting her arms around the little creature's neck, said in a sympathetic voice, "What is it, little snowflake? Why do you call like that, as if you're in trouble?" The goat pressed closer to Heidi in a confiding way and left off bleating. Peter called out from where he was sitting, for he had not yet got to the end of his bread and cheese. "She cries like that because the old goat is not with her. She was sold at Mountainside the day before yesterday, and so will not come up the mountain any more." "Who is the old goat?" called Heidi back. "Why, your mother, of course," was the answer. "Where's the grandmother?" called Heidi again. "She has none." "And the grandfather?" "She has none." "Oh, you poor little snowflake!" exclaimed Heidi, clasping the animal gently to her. "But do not cry like that any more. See now, I shall come up here with you every day so that you will not be alone any more. And if you want anything, you have only to come to me." The goats were now beginning to climb the rocks again, each seeking for the plants it liked on its own fashion. Some jumping over everything they met till they found what they wanted, others going more carefully and cropping all the nice leaves by the way, the Turk still now and then giving the others a poke with its horns. Little Swan and Little Bear clambered lightly up and never failed to find the best bushes, and then they would stand gracefully poised on their pretty legs, delicately nibbling at the leaves. Heidi stood with her hands behind her back, carefully noting all they did. "Peter," she said to the boy, who had again thrown himself down on the ground, "the prettiest of all the goats are Little Swan and Little Bear." "Yes, I know they are," was the answer. "Uncle brushes them down and washes them and gives them salt, and he has the nicest shed for them." All of a sudden Peter leaped to his feet and ran hastily after the goats. Heidi followed him as fast as she could, for she was too eager to know what had happened to stay behind. Peter dashed through the middle of the flock towards that side of the mountain where the rocks fell perpendicularly to a great depth below, and where any thoughtless goat, if it went too near, might fall over and break all its legs. He had caught sight of the inquisitive Greenfinch, taking leaps in that direction, and he was only just in time, for the animals had already sprung to the edge of the abyss. All Peter could do was to throw himself down and seize one of her hind legs. Greenfinch, thus taken by surprise, began bleating furiously, angry at being held so fast and preventing her continuing voyage of discovery. She struggled to get loose and endeavored so obstinately to leap forward that Peter shouted to Heidi to come and help him, for he could not get up and was afraid of pulling out the goat's leg altogether. Heidi had already run up, and she saw at once the danger both Peter and the animal were in. She quickly gathered a bunch of sweet-smelling leaves, and then, holding them under Greenfinch's nose, said coaxingly, "Come on, Greenfinch, you must not be naughty. Look, you might fall down there and break your leg, and that would give you dreadful pain." The young animal turned quickly and began contentedly eating the leaves out of Heidi's hand. Meanwhile, Peter got on his feet again and took hold of Greenfinch by the band round her neck, from which her bell was hung, and Heidi, taking hold of her in the same way on the other side, they led the wanderer back to the rest of the flock that had remained peacefully feeding. Peter, now he had got his goat in safety, lifted his stick in order to give her a good beating as punishment, and Greenfinch, seeing what was coming, shrank back in fear. But Heidi called out, "No, no, Peter, you must not strike her. See how frightened she is? She deserves it," growled Peter, and again lifted his stick. But Heidi flung herself after him and cried indignantly, "You have no right to touch her. It will hurt her. Let her alone." Peter looked with surprise at the commanding little figure, whose dark eyes were flashing, and reluctantly he let his stick drop. "Well, I will let her off if you will give me some more of your cheese tomorrow," he said, for he was determined to have something to make up to him for his fright. "You shall have it all tomorrow and every day. I do not want it," replied Heidi, giving ready consent to his demand. "And I will give you bread as well, as a large piece like you had today, but then you must promise never to beat Greenfinch or Snowflake or any of the other goats." "All right," said Peter, "I don't care," which meant that he would agree to the bargain and let go of Greenfinch, who joyfully sprang to join her companions. And thus, imperceptibly, the day had crept on to its close, and now the sun was on the point of sinking out of sight behind the high mountains. Heidi was again sitting on the ground, when all at once she sprang to her feet. "Peter! Peter! Everything's on fire! All the rocks are burning, and the great snow mountain in the sky! Oh, look! Look! The high rock up there is red with flame! Oh, the beautiful fiery snow! Stand up, Peter! See, the fires reach the great bird's nest! Look at the rocks! Look at the fir trees! Everything is on fire!" "It is always like that," said Peter composedly, continuing to peel his stick. "But it is not really fire." "What is it, then?" cried Heidi. "It gets like that of itself," explained Peter. "Look! Look!" cried Heidi in fresh excitement. "Now they have turned all rose-color. Look at that one covered with snow, and that with the high-pointed rocks. What do you call them?" "Mountains have not any names," he answered. "Oh, how beautiful! Look at the crimson snow, and up there on the rocks there are ever so many roses. Oh, now they are turning gray. Oh, now all the color has died away. It's all gone, Peter." And Heidi sat down on the ground, looking as full of distress as if everything had really come to an end. "It will come again tomorrow," said Peter. "Get up, we must go home now." He whistled to his goats, and together they all started on their homeward way. "Is it like that every day? Shall we see it every day that we bring the goats up here?" asked Heidi as she clambered down the mountain at Peter's side. She waited eagerly for his answer, hoping that he would tell her it was so. "It is like that most days," he replied. "But will it be like that tomorrow for certain?" Heidi persisted. Yes, tomorrow for certain," Peter assured her in answer. Heidi now felt quite happy again, and her little brain was so full of new impressions and new thoughts that she did not speak any more until they had reached the hut. The grandfather was sitting under the fir tree, where he had put up a new seat. Heidi ran up to him, followed by the white and brown goats, for they knew their own master and stall. Peter called after her, "Come with me again tomorrow. Good night," for he was anxious for more than one reason that Heidi should go with him the next day. "Oh, grandfather," cried Heidi, "it was so beautiful! The fire and the roses on the rocks, and the blue and the yellow flowers, and look what I have brought you!" And opening the apron that held her flowers, she shook them all out at her grandfather's feet. But the poor flowers, how changed they were! Heidi hardly knew them again. They looked like dried bits of hay. Not a single little flower cup stood open. "Oh, grandfather, what is the matter with them?" exclaimed Heidi in shocked surprise. "They were not like that this morning. Why do they look so now?" "They like to stand out there in the sun, not to be shut up in an apron," said her grandfather. "Then I will never gather any more. But, grandfather, why did the great bird go on croaking so?" she continued in an eager tone of inquiry. "Go along now and get into your bath while I go and get some milk. When we are together at supper, I will tell you all about it." Heidi obeyed, and then later she was sitting in her high stool before her milk bowl with her grandfather beside her. She repeated her question. "Why does the great bird go on croaking and screaming down at us, Grandfather?" "He's mocking at the people who live down below in the villages, because they all go huddling and gossiping together and encourage one another in evil talking and deeds. He calls out, 'If you would separate and each go your own way and come up here and live on a height as I do, it would be better for you.'" There was almost a wildness in the old man's voice as he spoke, so that Heidi seemed to hear the croaking of the bird again, even more distinctly. "Why haven't the mountains any names?" Heidi went on. "They have names," answered her grandfather, "and if you can describe one of them to me that I know, I will tell you what it's called." "I'm not sure. Are you going to come up? Come on. Are you just going to sit there and look at me? Hang on a second. Impending cat. Nice job. Come on, lap. There we go. You're so sweet. I love you. Okay. We're continuing. He likes story time. Heidi then described to him the rocky mountain with the two high peaks so exactly that the grandfather was delighted. "Just so, I know it," and he told her its name. Then Heidi told him of the mountain with the great snowfield and how it had been on fire. The grandfather explained to her that it was the sun that did it. When he says good night to the mountain, he throws his most beautiful colors over them, so that they may not forget him before he comes again the next day. Heidi was delighted with this explanation, and could hardly bear to wait for another day to come that she might once more climb up with the goats and see how the sun bid good night to the mountains. But she had to go to bed first, and all night she slept soundly on her bed of hay, dreaming of nothing but shining mountains with red roses all over them, among which happy little Snowflake went leaping in and out. Chapter 4. Shooting Down the Mountainside. The next morning the sun came out early, as bright as ever, and then Peter appeared with the goats, and again the two children climbed up together to the high meadows, and so it went on day after day, till Heidi, passing her life thus among the grass and flowers, was burnt brown with the sun, and grew so strong and healthy that nothing ever ailed her. She was happy, too, and lived from day to day as free and light-hearted as the little birds that made their homes among the green forest trees. Then the autumn came, and the wind blew louder and stronger, and the grandfather would say sometimes, "Today you must stay at home, Heidi. A sudden gust of wind would blow a little thing like you over the rocks into the valley below in a moment." Whenever Peter heard that he must go alone, he looked very unhappy, for he saw nothing but mishap of all kinds ahead, and did not know how he should bear the long, dull day without Heidi. Then, too, there was the good meal he would miss, and besides that, the goats of these days were so naughty and obstinate that he had twice the usual trouble with them, for they had grown so accustomed to Heidi's presence that they would run in every direction and refuse to go on unless she was with them. Heidi was never unhappy, for whenever she found something to interest or amuse her. She liked best, it is true, to go with Peter up to the flowers and the great bird, but she also found her grandfather's hammering and sawing and carpentering very entertaining. And if it should chance to be the day when the large round goat's milk cheese was made, she enjoyed beyond measure watching her grandfather stir the great cauldron. The thing which attracted her most, however, was the waving and roaring of the 3 old fir trees on these windy days. She would stand beneath them and look up, unable to tear herself away, looking and listening while they bowed and swayed and roared as the mighty wind rushed through them. There was no longer now the warm, bright sun that had shone all through the summer, so Heidi went to the cupboard and got out her shoes and stockings and dress. Then it grew very cold, and Peter would come up early in the morning, blowing on his fingers to keep them warm. But he soon left off coming, for one night there was a heavy fall of snow, and the next morning the whole mountain was covered with it, and not a single little green leaf even was to be seen anywhere upon it. There was no Peter that day, and Heidi stood at the little window looking out in wonderment. For the snow was beginning again, and the thick flakes kept falling till the snow was up to the window, and still they continued to fall, and the snow grew higher, so that at last the window could not be opened, and she and her grandfather were shut up fast within the hut. Hi, Snockings. Are you going to make up your mind this time? There we go. Let's see how long she stays. Heidi thought this was great fun and ran from one window to the other. The next day, the snow having ceased, the grandfather went out and shoveled it away from the house and threw it into such great heaps that they looked like mountains. Heidi and her grandfather was sitting one afternoon on their three-legged stools before the fire when there came a great thump at the door. It was Peter, all white with snow, for he had had to fight his way through the deep snowdrifts. He had been determined, however, to climb up to the hut, for it was a week now since he had seen Heidi. "Good evening," said he as he came in. Then he went and placed himself as near the fire as he could, his whole face beaming with pleasure at finding himself there. Heidi looked on in astonishment, for Peter was beginning to thaw all over with the warmth, so that he had the appearance of a trickling waterfall. "Well, General, how goes it with you?" said the grandfather. "Now that you have lost your army, you will have to turn to your pen and pencil." "Why must he turn to his pen and pencil?" asked Heidi immediately, full of curiosity. "During the winter he must go to school," explained her grandfather, "and learn how to read and write. It's a bit hard, although useful sometimes afterwards." "Am I not right, General?" "Yes, indeed," assented Peter. Heidi's interest was now thoroughly awakened, and she had so many questions to ask Peter about school, and the conversation took so long that he had time to get thoroughly dry. "Well, now, General, you have been under fire for some time and must want some refreshments. Come and join us," said the grandfather as he brought the supper out of the cupboard, and Heidi pushed the stools to the side. There was also now a bench fastened against the wall, for he was no longer alone. The grandfather had put up seats of various kinds here and there, long enough to hold 2 persons. For Heidi had a way of always keeping close to her grandfather, whether he was walking, sitting, or standing. Peter opened his round eyes very wide when he saw what a large piece of meat Almuncle gave him on his thick slice of bread. It was a long time since Peter had had anything so nice to eat. As soon as the pleasant meal was over, he began to get ready for returning home, for it was already growing dark. He had said his good night and his thanks, and was just going out when he turned and said, "I shall come again next Sunday, and this day week." Interesting. "I shall come again next Sunday, this day week, and my grandmother sent word that she would like you to come and see her some day." It was quite a new idea to Heidi that she should go and pay anybody a visit, and she could not get it out of her head, so the first thing she said to her grandfather the next day was, "I must go down to see grandmother today. She will be expecting me." "The snow is too deep," answered the grandfather, trying to put her off. Not a day passed but she would said 5 or 6 times to grandfather, "I must certainly go today. The grandmother will be waiting for me." On the 4th day, when Heidi was sitting on her high stool at dinner with the bright sun shining in upon her through the window, she again repeated her little speech. "I must certainly go down to see the grandmother today, or else I shall keep her waiting too long." The grandfather rose from the table, climbing up to the hayloft, and brought down the thick sack that was Heidi's coverlid, and said, "Come along, then." The child skipped out gleefully after him into the glittering world of snow. The old fir trees were standing now quite silent, their branches covered with the white snow, and they looked so lovely as they glittered and sparkled in the sunlight that Heidi jumped for joy at the sight and kept on calling out, come here, grandfather! The fir trees are all silver and gold." The grandfather had gone into the shed, and he now came out dragging a large hand sleigh. Inside there was a low seat, and the sleigh could be pushed forward and guided by the feet of the one who sat upon it, with the help of a pole that was fastened to the side. The old man got in and lifted the child onto his lap. Then he wrapped her up in the sack that she might keep nice and warm, and put his left arm closely round her, for it was necessary to hold her tight during the coming journey. He now grasped the pole with his right hand and gave the sleigh a push forward with his 2 feet. It shot down the mountainside with such rapidity that Heidi thought they were flying through the air like a bird, and shouted aloud with delight. Suddenly they came to a standstill, and there they were at Peter's hut. Her grandfather lifted her out and unwrapped her. "There you are. Now go in, and when it begins to grow dark you must start on your way home again." Then he left her and went up the mountain, pulling his sleigh after him. Heidi opened the door of the hut and stepped into a tiny room that looked very dark, with a fireplace and a few dishes on a wooden shelf. This was the little kitchen. She opened another door and found herself in another small room, for the place was not a herdsman's hut like her grandfather's, with one large room in the ground floor and a hayloft above, but a very old cottage, where everything was narrow and poor and shabby. A table was close to the door, and as Heidi stepped in she saw a woman sitting at it, putting a patch on a waistcoat, which Heidi recognized as once as Peter's. In the corner sat an old woman, bent with age, spinning. Heidi was quite sure this was the grandmother, so she went up to the spinning wheel and said, "Good day, grandmother. I have come at last. Did you think I was a long time coming?" The old woman raised her head and felt for the hand that the child held out to her, and when she had found it, she passed her own over it thoughtfully for a few seconds. Then she said, "Are you the child who lives up with Uncle? Are you Heidi?" Yes, answered Heidi, "and I have just come down in the sleigh with grandfather." "It is possible. Is it possible? Why, your hands are quite warm. Brigitte, did Uncle come himself with the child?" Peter's mother had left her work and risen from the table, and now stood looking at Heidi with curiosity, scanning her from head to toe. "I do not know, mother, whether Uncle came himself. It is hardly likely. The child probably makes a mistake." But Heidi looked steadily at the woman and said, "I know quite well who wrapped me up in my bed cover and brought me down in the sleigh. It was grandfather." There was some truth behind, then, perhaps, in what Peter used to tell us of Uncle during the summer, when we thought he must be wrong, said the grandmother. "But who would ever have believed that such a thing was possible? I did not think the child would live 3 weeks up there. What is she like, Brigitte?" The latter had so thoroughly examined Heidi on all sides that she was well able to describe her to her mother. Heidi, meanwhile, had not been idle. She had made the round of the room and looked carefully at everything there was to be seen. All of a sudden she exclaimed, "Grandmother, one of your shutters is flapping backwards and forwards. Grandfather would put a nail in it and make it all right in a minute. It will break one of the panes some day. Look how it keeps on banging." "Oh, dear child," said the old woman, "I'm not able to see it, but I can hear that and many other things besides the shutter. Everything about the place rattles and creaks when the wind is blowing, and it gets inside through all the cracks and holes. The house is going to pieces, and in the night, when the 2 others are asleep, I often lie awake in fear and trembling, thinking that the whole place will give way and fall and kill us. And there is not a creature to mend anything for us, for Peter does not understand such work." "But why cannot you see, grandmother, that the shutter is loose? Look, there it goes again. See, that one there." And Heidi pointed to the particular shutter. "Last child, I can see nothing." "Nothing," said the grandmother in a voice of lamentation. "But if I were to go outside and put back the shutter so that you have more light, then you could see, grandmother?" No, not even then. No one can make it light for me again." "But if you were to go outside among all the white snow, then surely you would find it light. Just come with me, grandmother, and I will show you." Heidi took hold of the old woman's hand to lead her along, for she was beginning to feel quite distressed at the thought of her being without light. "Let me be, dear child. It is always dark for me now, whether it's snow or sun. It will never be light for me again on earth. Never." At these words, Heidi broke into loud crying. In her distress, she kept on sobbing out, "Who can make it light for you again? Can no one do it? Isn't there anyone who can do it?" The grandmother now tried to comfort the child, but it was not easy to quiet her. Heidi did not often weep, but when she did, she could not get over her trouble for a long while. At last the old woman said, "Dear Heidi, you cannot think how glad I am to hear a kind word when I can no longer see, and it is such a pleasure to me to listen to you while you talk. So come and sit beside me and tell me what you do up there and how grandfather occupies himself. I knew him very well in the old days, but for many years now I have heard nothing of him except through Peter, and he never says much." This was a new and happy idea to Heidi, so she quickly dried her tears and said in a comforting voice, "Wait, grandmother, till I have told grandfather everything. He will make it all light for you again, I am sure, and will do something to that so that the house will not fall. He will put everything right for you." Heidi now began to give a lively description of her life with the grandfather, and of the days she spent on the mountain with the goats, and then went on to tell what she did during the winter, and how her grandfather was able to make all sorts of things, seats and stools and manners where the hay was put for little, and mangers where the hay was put for little Swan and little Bear, besides a new large water tub for her to bathe in when the summer came, and a new milk bowl and spoon. The grandmother listened with the greatest attention, only from time to time addressing her granddaughter. "Did you hear that, Brigitte? Do you hear what she is saying about Uncle?" The conversation was suddenly interrupted by a heavy thumping on the door, and in marched Peter, who stood stock still, opening his eyes with astonishment when he caught sight of Heidi. Then his face beamed with smiles as she called out, "Good evening, Peter." "What, is the boy back from school already?" exclaimed the grandmother in surprise. "I have not known an afternoon to pass so quickly as this one for years. How is the reading getting on, Peter?" "As usual," was Peter's answer. The old woman gave a little sigh. "Ah, well," she said, I'd hoped you would have something different to tell me by this time, as you were going to be 12 years old this February." "But what was it you hoped he would have to tell you?" asked Heidi, interested in all the grandmother said. "I mean that he ought to have learnt to read a bit by now," continued the grandmother. "Up there on the shelf is an old prayer book with beautiful songs in it, which I have not heard for a long time, and cannot now remember to repeat to myself. And I hoped that Peter would soon learn enough to be able to read one of them to me sometimes, but he finds it too difficult." Heidi now jumped up from her low chair, and holding out her hand hastily to the grandmother, said, "Good night, grandmother. It is getting dark. I must go home at once." And, bidding goodbye to Peter and his mother, she went towards the door, but the grandmother called out in an anxious voice, Wait, Heidi! You must not go alone like that. Peter must go with you. Have you got something warm to put round your throat?" "I have not got anything to put on," called back Heidi, "but I am sure I shall not be cold." And with that she ran outside and went off at such a pace that Peter had difficulty in overtaking her. The children had taken but a few steps before they saw the grandfather coming down to meet them, and in another minute his long strides had brought him to their side. "That's right, Heidi, you have kept your word," said the grandfather, and then wrapping the sack firmly around her, he lifted her in his arms and strode off with her up the mountain. They had no longer got inside the hut than Heidi at once began, "Grandfather, tomorrow we must take the hammer and the long nails and fasten grandmother's shutters and drive in a lot more nails in other places, for her house shakes and rattles all over." "We must we? Who told you that?" asked her grandfather. "Nobody told me, but I know it for all that," replied Heidi, "for everything is giving way, and when the grandmother cannot sleep, she lies trembling, for she thinks that every minute the house will fall down on their heads. And everything now is dark for grandmother, and she does not think anyone can make it light for her again. But you will be able to, I'm sure, grandfather. Tomorrow we must go and help her. We will, won't we, grandfather?" The child was clinging to the old man and looking up at him in trustful confidence. The grandfather looked down at Heidi and for a while without speaking, and then said, "Yes, Heidi, we will do something to stop the rattling. At least we can do that. We will go down about it tomorrow." The child went skipping round the room for joy, crying out, "We shall go tomorrow! We shall go tomorrow!" The grandfather kept his promise. On the following afternoon he brought the sleigh out again, and as on the previous day, he set Heidi down on the door of the grandmother's hut and said, "Go in now, and when it grows dark, come out again." Then he put the sack in the sleigh and went round the house. Heidi had hardly opened the door and sprung into the room when the grandmother called out from the corner, "It's the child again! Here she comes!" Heidi ran to her, and then quickly drew the little stool close up to the old woman, and seating herself upon it, began to tell and ask her all kinds of things. All at once came the sound of heavy blows against the walls of the hut, and grandmother gave such a start of alarm that she nearly upset the spinning wheel, and cried out in a trembling voice, "Oh, my God! Now it is coming! The house is going to fall upon us!" But Heidi caught her up by the arm and said soothingly, "No, no, grandmother, do not be frightened. It is only grandfather with his hammer. He is mending up everything so that you shan't have such fear and trouble." "Is it possible? Is it really possible? So the dear God has not forgotten us," exclaimed the grandmother. "Do you hear, Brigitte, what that noise is? Did you hear what the child says? Go outside, Brigitte, and if it is Uncle, tell him he must come inside a moment, that I may thank him." Brigitte went outside and found Uncle in the act of fastening some heavy pieces of new wood along the wall. She stepped up to him and said, "Good evening, Uncle. Mother and I thank you for doing us such a kind service, and she would like to tell you herself how grateful she is. I do not know who else would have done it for us. We shall not forget your kindness, for I am sure that will do," said the old man, interrupting her. "I know what you think of Uncle without your telling me. Go indoors again. I can find out for myself where the mending is wanted." Brigitte obeyed on the spot, for Uncle had a way with him that made few people care to oppose his will. He went on knocking with his hammer all round the house, and then mounted the narrow steps to the roof, and hammered away there until he had used up all the nails he had brought with him. Meanwhile it had been growing dark, and he had hardly come down from the roof and dragged the sleigh out from behind the goat shed, when Heidi appeared outside. The grandfather wrapped her up and took her in his arms as he had done the day before, for although he had to drag the sleigh up the mountain after him, he feared that if the child sat in it alone, her wrappings would fall off, and that she would be nearly, if not quite, frozen. So he carried her warm and safe in his arms. So the winter went by. After many years of joyless life, the blind grandmother had at last found something to make her happy. She listened for the little tripping footsteps as soon as day had come, and when she heard the door open and knew the child was really there, she would call out, "God be thanked, she has come again!" And Heidi had also grown very fond of the old grandmother, and when at last she knew for certain that no one could make it light for her again, she was overcome with sorrow. But the grandmother told her again that she felt the darkness much less when Heidi was with her, and so every fine winter's day the child came travelling down in her sleigh. The grandfather always took her, never raising any objection. Indeed, he always carried the hammer and sundry other things down in the sleigh with him, and many an afternoon was spent by him in making the goatherd's cottage sound and tight. It no longer groaned and rattled the whole night through, and the grandmother, who for many winters had not been able to sleep in peace as she did now, said she should never forget what the uncle had done for her. Chapter 5. A Railroad Journey. Heidi was now in her 8th year. She had learnt all kinds of useful things from her grandfather. She knew how to look after the goats as well as anyone. The little Swan and little Bear, who followed her like two faithful dogs, and and little Swan and little Bear would follow her like two faithful dogs, and give a loud bleat of pleasure when they heard her voice. Twice during the course of this last winter, Peter had brought up a message from the schoolmaster at Dorfley, who sent word to Uncle that he ought to send Heidi to school, as she was over the usual age, and ought indeed to have gone the winter before. Uncle had sent word back each time that the schoolmaster would find him at home if he had anything he wished to say to him, but that he did not intend to send Heidi to school. As Heidi was running about one sunny March morning, and had just jumped over the water trough for the 10th time at least, she nearly fell backwards into it with fright, for there in front of her stood an old gentleman dressed in black. When he saw how startled she was, he said in a kind voice, "Don't be afraid of me, for I am very fond of children. Shake hands! You must be the Heidi I have heard of. Where's your grandfather?" "He is sitting by the table making round wooden spoons," Heidi informed him as she opened the door. It was the old village pastor from Dorfley, who had been a neighbor of Uncle's when he lived down there. He stepped inside the hut, and going up to the old man, who was bending over his work, said, "Good morning, neighbor." The grandfather looked up in surprise, and then rising, said, "Good morning," in return. He pushed his chair toward the visitor as he continued, "If you do not mind a wooden seat, there is one for you." The pastor sat down. "It is a long time since I have seen you, neighbor," he said. "I think you already know what it is that has brought me here." And as he spoke, he looked towards the child who was standing at the door. "Heidi, go off to the goats," said her grandfather. "You can take them a little salt and stay with them till I come." Heidi vanished on the spot. "The child ought to have been at school a year ago, and most certainly this last winter," said the pastor. "The schoolmaster sent you word about it, but you gave him no answer. What are you thinking of doing with the child, neighbor?" "I'm thinking of not sending her to school," was the answer. "How are you going to let her grow up, then?" "I'm going to let her grow up and be happy among the goats and birds. With them she is safe and will learn nothing evil." "But the child is not a goat or a bird. She is a human being. It is time she began her lessons. This is the last winter she must be allowed to run wild. Next winter she must come regularly to school every day." "She will do no such thing," said the old man with calm determination. "Do you mean that you intend to stick obstinately to your decision?" said the pastor, growing somewhat angry. You have been about the world, and I should have given you credit for some sense, neighbor." "Indeed," replied the old man. "Could you expect me to send a young child down the mountain on ice-cold mornings through storm and snow, and let her return at night when the wind is raging? Have you forgotten the child's mother, Adelaide? She was a sleepwalker and had fits. Might not the child be attacked in the same way if I obliged to overexert herself? And you think you can come and force me to send her? I will go before all the courts of justice in the country, and then we shall see who will force me to do it." "Perhaps you are right, neighbor," said the pastor in a friendly tone of voice. "If it is possible to send the child to school from here, come down into Dorfley and live again among your fellow men. What sort of a life is this you lead alone, and with bitter thoughts towards God and man?" "No, pastor, as to going down to Dorfley to live, that is far from my thoughts. The people despise me, and I them. It is therefore best for all of us that we live apart." The visitor had risen and stood holding out his hand to the old man as he added with renewed earnestness, "I will wager that next winter you will be down among us again, and we shall be good neighbors as of old. Promise me that you will come and live with us again and become reconciled to God and man." Uncle gave the pastor his hand and answered him calmly and firmly, "You mean well by me, I know, but I will not send the child to school, nor come and live among you." "Then God help you," said the pastor as he left the hut and went down the mountain. Uncle was out of humor. When Heidi said as usual that afternoon, "Can we go down to grandmother now?" he answered, "Not today." He did not speak again the whole day, and the following morning, when Heidi again asked the same question, he replied, "We will see." But before the dinner bowls had been cleared away, another visitor arrived, and this time it was Deet. She wore a fine feathered hat and a long trailing dress which swept the floor. The grandfather looked her up and down without uttering a word, but Deet was prepared with an exceedingly amiable speech and began at once to praise the looks of the child. She should hardly have known her again, and it was evident that Heidi had been happy and well cared for with her grandfather. But she had just heard of something that would be a lucky chance for her. Some wealthy people in Frankfurt wanted a companion for their only daughter who was an invalid. Heidi was just the sort of child they were looking for, simple-minded and unspoiled, and after Deet had given them a description of Heidi, they had agreed to take her. And no one could tell what good fortune there might not be in store for her. For if these rich people should take a fancy to Heidi, have you nearly finished what you had to say?" broke in Uncle, who had allowed her to talk on uninterrupted so far. "Ugh!" exclaimed Deet, throwing up her head in disgust. "One would think I had been talking to you about the most ordinary matter. Why, there is not one person in all Prattigau who would not thank God if I were to bring them such a piece of news as I am bringing you." "You may take your news to anybody you like. I will have nothing to do with it." Deet leaped up from her seat like a rocket and cried, "If that is all you have to say about it, why, then I will give you a bit of my mind. The child is now 8 years old and knows nothing, and you will not let her learn. You will not send her to church or school, as I was told down in Dorfli, and she is my own sister's child. I am responsible for what happens to her, and this is a good opening for her. I have everybody in Dorfli on my side. There is not one person there who will not take my part against you, and I advise you to think well before bringing it into court, if that is your intention. There are certain things which might be brought up against you that you would not care to hear, for when one has to do with law courts, there is a great deal raked up that had been forgotten." "Be silent!" thundered the uncle, and his eyes flashed with anger. "Go and be done with you. Never let me see you again with your hat and feather." And with that he strode out of the hut. "You have made grandfather angry," said Heidi, and her dark eyes had anything but a friendly expression in them as she looked up at Deet. "You will soon be all right again. Come now," said Deet hurriedly, "and show me where your clothes are." "I am not coming," said Heidi. Come, you will have all sorts of good things that you never dreamed of." Then she went to the cupboard and, taking out Heidi's things, rolled them up in a bundle. "Come along now, there's your hat. It is very shabby, but will do for the present. Put it on and let us make haste off." "I'm not coming," repeated Heidi. "Don't be stupid and obstinate like a goat. I suppose it's from the goats you have learnt to be so. Listen to me. You saw your grandfather was angry and heard what he said, that he did not wish to ever see us again. He wants you to go away with me, and you must not make him angrier still. You can't think how nice it is at Frankfurt, and if you do not like it, you can come back again. Your grandfather will be in a good humor by that time." "Can I return at once and be back home again here this evening?" asked Heidi. "What are you talking about? Come along now. I tell you that you can come back here when you like. Today we shall go as far as Meienfeld, and early tomorrow we shall start in the train. It will bring you home again in no time when you wish it, for it goes as fast as the wind." They started down the mountain, and as they neared the grandmother's hut, they heard Peter coming round the corner, carrying an immense bundle of long, thick hazel sticks on his shoulders. He stood still and stared at the two approaching figures. As they came up to him, he exclaimed, "Where are you going, Heidi?" "I am only just going over to Frankfurt for a little visit with Deet," she replied. "But I must first run in to grandmother. She will be expecting me." No, you must not stop to talk. It is already too late," said Deet, holding Heidi, who was struggling to get away. "You can go in when you come back, and she pulled the child on with her. Peter ran into the hut and banged against the table with his bundle of sticks with such violence that everything in the room shook, and his grandmother leaped up with a cry of alarm from her spinning wheel. "What is it? What is the matter?" she cried the frightened old woman. "She's taking Heidi away!" exclaimed Peter. Who? Where to, Peter? Where to?" asked the grandmother, growing still more agitated. But even as she spoke, she guessed what had happened, for Brigitte had told her shortly before that she had seen Diet going up to Uncle. The old woman opened the window and called out beseechingly, "Diet! Diet, do not take the child away from us! Do not take her away!" The two who were hastening down the mountain heard her voice, and Diet evidently caught the words, for she grasped Heidi's hand more firmly. Heidi struggled to get free, crying, "Grandmother is calling! I must go to her!" But Diet had no intention of letting the child go, and quieted her as best she could by promising that she could take something nice back to grandmother. This was a new idea to Heidi, and it pleased her so much that Diet had no longer any difficulty in getting her along. "What can I take back to her?" Heidi asked. "A soft roll of white bread. She would really enjoy that, for now she is old she can hardly eat the hard black bread," answered Diet. "Why, she always gives it back to Peter, telling him it is too hard," affirmed Heidi. "Do let us make haste, for then perhaps we can get back soon from Frankfurt, and I shall be able to give her the white bread today." And Heidi started off, running so fast that Diet, with the bundle under her arm, could scarcely keep up with her. From that day forward, Uncle looked fiercer and more forbidding than ever when he came down and passed through Dorfli. He spoke to no one, and looked such an ogre as he came along with his pack of cheese on his back, his immense stick in his hand, and his thick frowning eyebrows, that the women would call to their little ones, "Take care, get out of Uncle's way, or he may hurt you." The old man took no notice of anybody as he strode through the village on his way to the valley below, where he sold his cheeses and brought what bread and meat he wanted for himself. After he had passed, the villagers all crowded together, looking after him. They agreed that it was a great mercy the child had got away from him. Only the blind grandmother would have nothing to say against him, and told those who came to bring her work how kind and thoughtful he had been with the child, how good to her and her daughter, and how many afternoons he had spent mending the house. All this was repeated down in Dorfli, but most of the people who heard it said that grandmother was too old to understand, and very likely had not heard rightly what was said, as she was blind. Probably she was also deaf. Chapter 6. Clara, the patient little invalid. In her home in Frankfurt, Clara, the little daughter of Mr. Sesemann, was lying in the invalid couch on which she spent her whole day, being wheeled in it from room to room. Her little face was thin and pale, and at this moment her two soft blue eyes were fixed on the clock, which seemed to her to go very slowly this day, and with a slight accent of impatience, which was very rare with her, she asked, "Isn't it time yet, Miss Rottenmeier?" This lady was sitting very upright at a small work table, busy with her embroidery. She wore a dome-shaped headpiece, which made her look very solemn and dignified. For many years past, since Clara's mother had died, the housekeeping and the superintendence of the servants had been entrusted to Miss Rottenmeier. The father, who was often away from home, left her in sole charge with the condition only that his little daughter should have a voice in all matters, and that nothing should be done against her wish. As Clara was putting her impatient question for the second time, Diet and Heidi arrived at the front door. Tinette, the maid in dainty cap and apron, ushered them upstairs into the library. Diet remained standing politely near the door, still holding Heidi tightly by the hand, for she did not know what the child might take it into her head to do amid these new surroundings. Miss Rottenmeier rose slowly and went up to the little new companion for the daughter of the house to see what she was like. She did not seem very pleased with her appearance. Heidi was dressed in her plain little woolen frock, and her hat was an old straw one bent out of shape. The child looked innocently out from beneath it, gazing with unconcealed astonishment at the lady's towering headdress. "What is your name?" asked Miss Rottenmeier, after examining the child for some minutes, while Heidi in return kept her eyes steadily fixed upon the lady. "Heidi," she answered in a clear, ringing voice. What? That's no Christian name for a child. You were not christened that." "What name did they give you when you were baptized?" continued Miss Rottenmeier. "I do not remember," replied Heidi. "What a way to answer," said the lady, shaking her head. "Deet, is the child a simpleton or only saucy?" "If the lady will allow me, I will speak for the child, for she is very unaccustomed to strangers," said Deet, who had given Heidi a silent poke for making such an unsuitable answer. "She is certainly not stupid, nor yet saucy. She speaks exactly as she thinks. This is the first time she has ever been in a gentleman's house, and she does not know good manners, but she is very willing to learn. She was christened Adelaide, after her mother, my sister, who is now dead." "Well, that's a name that one can pronounce," remarked Miss Rottenmeier. "But I must tell you, Deet, that I am astonished to see so young a child. I told you that I wanted a companion of the same age as the young lady of the house, one who could share her lessons and all her other occupations. Miss Clara is now over 12. What age is this child?" "If the lady will allow me," began Deet again in her usual fluent manner. "I myself had lost count of her exact age. She is certainly a little younger, but not much. I cannot say precisely, but I think she is 10 or thereabouts." "Grandfather told me I was 8, put in Heidi. Deet gave her another poke, but as the child had not the least idea why she did so, she was not at all confused. "What, only 8?" cried Miss Rottenmeier angrily. 4 years too young! Of what use is such a child? And what have you learnt? What books did you have to learn from?" "None," said Heidi. "What? How then did you learn to read?" continued the lady. "I have never learnt to read, nor Peter neither," Heidi informed her. "Mercy upon us! You do not know how to read? Is it really so?" exclaimed Miss Rottenmeier, greatly horrified. "Is it possible? Not able to read? What have you learnt, then?" "Nothing," said Heidi, with unflinching truthfulness. "Young woman," said the lady to Deet, "this is not at all the sort of companion we want. How could you think of bringing me a child like this?" But Deet was not to be put down so easily, and answered warmly, "If you will allow me, the child is exactly what I thought you required. She is unlike all other children, and I thought this child seemed as if made for the place. But I must go, for my mistress will be waiting for me. If you will permit, I will come again soon and see how she is getting on." And with a bow, Deet quickly left the room and ran upstairs. Miss Rottenmeier stood for a moment, taken aback, and then ran after Deet, but she had disappeared out the front door. Heidi remained where she had been standing since she first came in. Clara had looked on during the interview without speaking. Now she beckoned to Heidi and said, "Come here." Heidi went up to her. "Would you rather be called Heidi or Adelaide?" asked Clara. "I am never called anything but Heidi," was the child's prompt answer. "Then I shall always call you by that name," said Clara. "It suits you. I have never heard it before, but neither have I ever seen a child like you before. Have you always had that short curly hair?" "Yes, I think so," said Heidi. "Are you pleased to come to Frankfurt?" went on Clara. "No, but I shall go home again tomorrow and take grandmother a white loaf," explained Heidi. "Well, you are a funny child," exclaimed Clara. "Don't you know you were sent for to come here and stay with me and share my lessons? They are dreadfully dull, and I think the morning will never pass away. My tutor comes every morning at around 10 o'clock, and then we go on with lessons till 2, and it does seem such a long time. Sometimes he takes up the book and holds it close up to his face, as if he were very short-sighted, but I know it's only because he wants to gape, and Miss Rottenmeier takes her large handkerchief out also now and then, and covers her face with it, as if she was moved by what we have been reading, but That is only because she is longing to gape too, and I myself often want to gape, but I dare not, for if Miss Rottenmeier sees me gaping, she runs off at once and fetches the cod-liver oil and says I must have a dose, as I am getting weak again, and the cod-liver oil is horrible. But now it will be much more amusing, for I shall be able to lie back and listen while you learn to read." Heidi shook her head doubtfully when she heard of learning to read. "Oh, nonsense, Heidi, of course you must learn to read. Everyone must, and my tutor is very kind, and never cross, and he will explain everything to you. But mind, when he explains anything to you, you won't be able to understand. But don't ask any questions, or else he will go on explaining, and you will understand less than ever. Later, when you have learnt more and know about things yourself, then you will begin to understand what he meant." Miss Rottenmeier now came back into the room. She had not been able to overcome Deet, and was evidently very much put out. She walked backwards and forwards in a state of agitation between the study and the dining room, and began scolding the butler. "Make haste, Sebastian, or we shall get no dinner today at all," she said. Then, hurrying out, she called to Tinette to see that the bedroom was prepared for the little girl who had just arrived. Meanwhile, Sebastian had flung open the folding doors leading into the dressing room with rather more noise than he need, for he was feeling cross, although he did not dare answer back when Miss Rottenmeier spoke to him. He went up to Clara's chair to wheel her into the next room. Heidi stood staring at him. Seeing her eyes fixed upon him, he suddenly growled out, "Well, what is there in me to stare at like that?" which he would certainly not have done if he had been aware that Miss Rottenmeier was just then entering the room. "You look so like Peter," answered Heidi. The housekeeper clasped her hands in horror. "Is it possible?" she stammered half aloud. "She is now addressing the servant as if he were a friend. I never could have imagined such a child." Sebastian wheeled the couch into the dining room and helped Clara on to her chair. Miss Rottenmeier took the seat beside her and made a sign to Heidi to take the other opposite. Beside Heidi's plate lay a nice white roll with her eyes lighted up with pleasure as she saw it. When Sebastian came up to her side and handed her the dish of fish, she looked at the roll and asked, "Can I have it?" Sebastian nodded, and Heidi immediately seized the roll and put it in her pocket. Sebastian still remained standing beside Heidi. It was not his duty to speak, nor to move away until she had helped herself. Heidi looked wonderingly at him for a minute or two, and then said, "Am I to eat some of that too?" Sebastian nodded again. "Give me some, then," she said, looking calmly at her plate. "I see I shall have to teach you the first rules of behaviour," said the housekeeper with a sigh. "You must not speak to Sebastian at table, or at any other time unless you have an order to give him, and then you are not to address him as if he were someone belonging to you. You never let me hear you speak to him in that way again. It is the same with Tinette, and for myself you are to address me as you hear others doing. Clara must herself decide what you are to call her." "Why, Clara, of course," put in the latter. Then, following a long list of rules as to general behaviour, during the course of which Heidi's eyes gradually closed, for she had been up before 5 o'clock that morning and had had a long journey. She leaned back in her chair and fell fast asleep. Miss Rottenmeier, having at last come to the end of her lecture, said, "Now remember what I have said, Adelaide. Have you understood it all?" "Heidi has been asleep for ever so long," said Clara, her face rippling all over with amusement, for she had not had such an entertaining dinner for a long time. "Is it really insupportable that one has to go through with this child?" exclaimed Miss Rottenmeier in great indignation, and she rang the bell so violently that Tinette and Sebastian both came running in. But no noise was sufficient to wake Heidi, and it was with difficulty that they roused her sufficiently to get her to her bedroom. I don't remember the Frankfurt part being so early in the book. We're not even a quarter of the way through. Chapter 7. The Unfriendly Housekeeper. When Heidi opened her eyes on her first morning in Frankfurt, she could not think where she was. Then she rubbed them and looked about her. She was sitting up in a high white bed in a large, wide room with very long white curtains. Near the window stood 2 chairs covered with large flowered materials, and then came a sofa with the same flowers, in front of which was a round table. In the corner was a washstand with things upon it that Heidi had never seen in her life before. But now all at once she remembered that she was in Frankfurt. She jumped out of bed and dressed herself. Then she ran first to one window and then another. She wanted to see the sky and country outside. She felt like a bird in a cage behind those great curtains. But they were too heavy for her to put aside, so she crept underneath them to get to the window. But she could see nothing but walls and windows. She felt quite frightened and ran backwards and forwards, trying to open first one and then the other of the windows, for she felt that somewhere outside there must be the green grass and the last unmelted snows on the mountain slopes. But the windows remained immovable, try what Heidi would to open them. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, and immediately after Tinette put her head inside and said, "Breakfast is ready." Heidi had no idea what an invitation so worded meant, and Tinette's face did not encourage any questions on Heidi's part. Heidi was sharp enough to read its expression and act accordingly, so she drew a little stool out from under the table, put it in the corner, and sat down upon it, and silently awaited what would happen next. Shortly after Miss Rottenmeier appeared. She seemed very much put out, and called to Heidi, "What is the matter with you, Adelaide? Don't you understand what breakfast is? Come along at once." Heidi had no difficulty in understanding now, and followed at once. Clara gave her a kindly greeting, her face looking considerably more cheerful than usual, for she looked forward to all kinds of new things happening again that day. Breakfast passed off quietly. Heidi ate her bread and butter in a perfectly correct manner, and when the meal was over and Clara wheeled back into the study, Miss Rottenmeier told her to follow and remain with Clara until the tutor should arrive and lessons begin. As soon as the children were alone again, Heidi asked, "How can one see out from here and look right down onto the ground?" "You must open the window and look out," replied Clara, amused. "But the windows won't open," responded Heidi sadly. "Yes, they will," Clara assured her. "You cannot open them, nor I either, but when you see Sebastian, you can ask him to open one." It was a great relief to Heidi to know that the windows could be opened and that one could look out. Clara now began to ask her questions about her home, and Heidi, "Would you make up your mind, Snockings? Come on." "Thank you." Clara now began to ask her questions about her home, and Heidi was delighted to tell her all about the mountain and the goats and the flowery meadows. Meanwhile, her tutor had arrived. Miss Rottenmeier, however, did not bring them straight into the study, but drew him first aside into the dining room, where she poured forth her troubles. It appeared that she had written some time back to Mr. Sesamon to tell him that his daughter very much desired to have a companion. Miss Rottenmeier had wished for this arrangement on her own behalf, as it would relieve her from having always to entertain the sick girl. The father had answered that he was quite willing to let his daughter have a companion, provided she was treated in every way like his own child. But now she went on to explain how dreadful she had been taken in about the child, and related all the unimaginable things of which she had already been guilty, so that not only would he have to begin with teaching her the ABCs, but would have to start with the most rudimentary instructions as regarding everything to do with daily life. She could see only one way out of this disastrous state of affairs, and that was for the tutor to declare that it was impossible for the two to learn together without detriment to Clara, who was so far ahead of the others. So that would be a good excuse for getting rid of the child. But she dared not send her home without Mr. Sesamon's orders, since he was aware that by this time the companion had arrived. The tutor was a cautious man, and said that if the little girl was backward in some things, she was probably advanced in others, and a little regular teaching would soon set the balance right. When Miss Rottenmeier saw that he was not ready to support her, and evidently quite ready to undertake teaching the alphabet, she opened the study door, which she quickly shut again as soon as she had gone through, remaining on the other side herself, for she had a perfect horror of the ABCs. She went up and down the dining room, thinking over in her own mind how the servants were to be told to address Adelaide. The father had written that she was to be treated exactly like his own daughter, and this would especially refer, she imagined, to the servants. She was not allowed, however, a very long interval of time for consideration, for suddenly the sound of a frightful crash was heard in the study, followed by frantic cries for Sebastian. She rushed into the room. There on the floor lie in a confused heap books, exercise books, and inkstands, with a tablecloth on the top, while from beneath them a dark stream of ink was flowing all across the floor. Heidi had disappeared. "Here's a state of things!" exclaimed Miss Rottenmeier. "Tablecloth, books, work-basket, everything lying in the ink! Is that unfortunate child, I suppose?" "Yes, Heidi did it," explained Clara, "but quite by accident. She must on no account be punished. She jumped up in such violent state to get away that she dragged the tablecloth along with her, and so everything went over. There were a number of vehicles passing. That is why she rushed off like that. Perhaps she has never seen a carriage." "Is it not as I said? She has not the smallest notion about anything. But where is the child who has caused all this trouble? Surely she has not run away. What would Mr. Sesamon say to me?" She ran out of the room and down the stairs. There at the bottom, standing in the open doorway, was Heidi, looking in amazement up and down the street. "What are you doing? What are you thinking of to run away like that?" called Miss Rottenmeier. "I heard the sound of the fir trees, but I cannot see where they are, and now I cannot hear them any more," answered Heidi, looking disappointedly in the direction whence the noise of the passing carriages had reached her, and which to Heidi had seemed like the blowing of the south wind in the trees, so that in great joy of heart she had rushed out to look at them. "Fir trees! Do you suppose we are in the woods? What ridiculous ideas are these? Come upstairs and see the mischief you have done." Heidi followed Miss Rottenmeier upstairs. She was quite astonished to see the disaster she had caused, for in her joy and haste to get to the fir trees, she had been unaware of having dragged everything after her. "I excuse you doing this, as it is the first time, but do not let me hear of you doing it a second time," Miss Rottenmeier said, pointing to the door. During your lesson time, you are to sit still and attend. If you cannot do this, I shall have to tie you to your chair. Do you understand?" "Yes," replied Heidi, "but I will certainly not move again." For now she understood that it was a rule to sit still while she was being taught. When Clara had been placed on her couch after dinner, and the housekeeper had retired to her room, Heidi waited for Sebastian, who was coming up from the kitchen with a tray of silver tea things, which he had to put away in the dining-room cupboard. As he reached the top stair, Heidi went up to him and addressed him in the formal manner she had been ordered to use by Miss Rottenmeier. Sebastian looked surprised and said somewhat curtly, "What is it you want, miss?" "How can a window be opened?" "Why, like that," said Sebastian, and he flung open one of the larger windows. Heidi ran to it, but she was not tall enough to see out, for her head only reached the sill. "There now, miss can look out and see what is going on below," said Sebastian as he brought her a high wooden stool to stand on. Heidi climbed up, and at last, as she thought, was going to see what she had been longing for. But she drew back her head with a look of great disappointment on her face. "Why, there's nothing outside but the stony streets," she said mournfully. "But if I went straight round to the other side of the house, what should I see there, Sebastian?" "None but what you see here," he told her. "Then where can I go to see right away over the whole valley?"
You would have to climb to the top of a high tower, a church tower.
Oh, did you change your name? It's cute. Booshfulness. Hi, I hope you're enjoying Storytime. Did you see my new art right here? I finished it last night. Let's see. You would have to climb to the top of a high tower, a church tower, like that one over there with the gold ball above it. Heidi got down quickly from her stool, ran to the door, down the steps, and out into the street. She passed a great many people, but they all seemed in such a hurry that Heidi thought they had no time to tell her which way to go. Then suddenly, at one of the street corners, she saw a boy carrying a hand organ on his back and a funny-looking animal on his arm. Heidi ran up to him and said, "Where's the tower with the gold ball at the top?" "I don't know," was the answer. "Do you know any other church with a high tower?" "Yes, I know one." "Come then and show it to me." "Show me first what you will give me," said the boy held out his hand as he spoke. Heidi searched about in her pocket and presently drew out a card on which was painted a garland of beautiful red roses. She looked at it first for a moment or two, for she felt really sorry to part with it. Clara had only that morning made her a present of it, but then, to look down into the valley and see all the lovely green slopes. "There," said Heidi, holding out the card. "Would you like to have that?" The boy drew back his hand and shook his head. "What would you like, then?" asked Heidi, not sorry to put the card back in her pocket. "Money." "I have none, but Clara has. I am sure she will give me some. How much do you want?" 5 cents. "Come along, then." They started off together along the street, and on the way Heidi asked her companion what he was carrying on his back. It was a hand organ, he told her, which played beautiful music when he turned the handle. All at once they found themselves in front of an old church with a high tower, and the boy said, "There it is." Heidi caught sight of a bell in the wall, which she now pulled with all her might. "If I go up to the tower, you must wait here, for I do not know the way back, and you will have to show me." "What will you give me then for that?" "Another 5 cents." They heard the key turning inside, and then someone pulled open the heavy creaking door. An old man came out, and at first looked with surprise and then anger at the children as he began scolding them. "What do you mean by ringing down like this? Can't you read what is written over the bell? For those who wish to go up to the tower." "But I do want to go up the tower," said Heidi. "What do you want up there?" said the old man. "Has somebody sent you?" "No," replied Heidi. "I only want to go up and look down on the valley." "Get along home with you, and don't try this trick again, or you may not come off so easily a second time." And with that he turned and was about to shut the door, but Heidi took hold of his coat and said beseechingly, "Let me go up just once." He looked round, and his mood changed as he saw her pleading eyes. He took hold of her hand and said kindly, "Well, if you really wish it so much, I will take you." The boy sat down on the church steps to show that he was content to wait where he was. When they had climbed to the top of the tower, the old man lifted Heidi up that she might look out of the open window. She saw beneath her a sea of roofs, towers, and chimney pots. She quickly drew back her head and said in a sad, disappointed voice, "It is not at all what I thought. You see now, a child like you does not understand anything about a view. Come along down and don't go ringing my bell again." On the way down they passed the tower keeper's room. At the far end of this was a large basket, in front of which sat a big gray cat. Heidi went up to the basket and broke out into expressions of delight. "Oh, the sweet little things, the darling kittens," she kept on saying as she jumped from side to side of the basket, so as not to lose any of the droll gambols of the 7 or 8 little kittens that were scrambling and rolling and falling over one another. "Would you like to have one?" said the old man, who enjoyed watching the child's pleasure. "For myself to keep?" said Heidi excitedly, who could hardly believe such happiness was to be hers.
Oh, yes, of course, more than one if you like. In short, you can take away the whole lot if you have room for them, for the old man was only too glad to think he could get rid of his kittens without more trouble.
But how can I take them with me? Asked Heidi, and was going quickly to see how many she could carry away in her hands, when the old cat sprang at her so fiercely that she shrank back in fear. I will take them for you if you tell me where, said the old man, stroking the cat to quiet her. To Mr. Sesame's, the big house where there is a gold dog's head on the door, with a ring in its mouth, exclaimed Heidi. The old man had had charge of the tower for many a long year and knew every house far and near. I know the house, he said, but when shall I bring them, and who shall I ask for? You are not one of the family, I am sure. No, but Clara will be so delighted when I take her to the kittens. If I could just take one or two away with me, one for myself and one for Clara, may I? Well, wait a moment, said the man, and he drew the cat cautiously away into his room, and leaving her by a bowl of milk, came out again and shut the door. Now take two of them. Heidi's eyes shone with delight. She picked up a white kitten and another striped white and yellow, and put one in the right and the other in the left pocket. Then she went downstairs. The boy was still standing outside on the steps. In a very short time they had reached the door with the large dog's head for a knocker. Heidi rang the bell. Sebastian opened it quickly, and when he saw it was Heidi, "Make haste, make haste!" he cried in a hurried voice. Heidi sprang hastily in, and Sebastian shut the door after her, leaving the boy, whom he had not noticed, standing in wonder on the steps. "Make haste, little miss," said Sebastian again. "Go straight into the dining room. They are already at table. Miss Rottenmeier looks like a loaded cannon. What could make little miss run off like that?" Heidi walked into the room. The housekeeper did not look up. Clara did not speak. There was an uncomfortable silence. Sebastian pushed her chair up for her, and when she was seated, Miss Rottenmeier said sternly, "Adelaide, you have behaved in a most unmannerly way by running out of the house as you did, without asking permission, without any one knowing a word about it, and then to go wandering about till this hour. I never heard of such behavior before." "Meow," came the answer back. This was too much for the lady's temper, which with raised voice she exclaimed, "You dare, Adelaide, after your bad manners, to answer me as if it were a joke." "I did not," began Heidi. "Meow, meow." "That will do," Miss Rottenmeier tried to say, but her voice was almost stifled with anger. "Get up and leave the room." I can't figure out how to do a good cat voice. I'm sorry. Heidi stood up frightened and again made an attempt to explain. "I really did not. Meow, meow, meow." "But Heidi," now put in Clara, "when you see that it makes Miss Rottenmeier angry, why do you keep on saying meow? It wasn't I, it's the kittens." Heidi was at last given time to say. "How? What? Kittens!" shrieked Miss Rottenmeier. "Sebastian! Tinette! Find the horrid little things! Take them away!" And she rose and fled into the study and locked the door. When Sebastian entered the dining room, Clara had the kittens on her lap, and Heidi was kneeling beside her, both laughing and playing with the tiny, graceful little animals. "Sebastian!" exclaimed Clara as he came in. "You must help us. You must find a bed for the kittens where Miss Rottenmeier will not spy them out, for she is so afraid of them that she will send them away at once. But we want to keep them and have them out whenever we are alone. Where can we put them?" "I will see to that," answered Sebastian willingly. "I will make a bed and a basket and put it in some place where the lady is not likely to go. You leave it to me." He set about the work at once, sniggling to himself the while, for he guessed there would be a further rumpus about this some day, and Sebastian was not without a certain pleasure in the thought of Miss Rottenmeier being a little disturbed. After some time had elapsed, Miss Rottenmeier opened the door a crack and called through, "Have you taken those dreadful little animals away, Sebastian?" He assured her twice that he had done so, and quickly and quietly, catching up the kittens from Clara's lap, disappeared with them. Miss Rottenmeier retired without speaking. Clara and Heidi following, happy in their minds at knowing that the kittens were lying in a comfortable bed. Alright, since we are only 5 minutes away from usual stream time, and I'm going to go ahead and end this story time stream now, but if you will stick around, I'm going to take a small break, and then we're going to do some The Room 3, see if I can find any more stuff that I had missed the previous playthrough. So yeah, I hope to see you soon. Bye.